Welcome to Current Affairs. My name is Nathan Robinson. I am the editor-in-chief of Current Affairs magazine. I am joined today by Van Jackson, Distinguished Fellow with the Asia Pacific Foundation of Canada, Senior Lecturer in International Relations at Victoria University of Wellington in New Zealand, and Defense and Strategy Fellow at the Center for Strategic Studies. Van Jackson is also the author of the new book, Pacific Power Paradox, American Statecraft, and the Fate of the Asian Peace, available from Yale University Press. And I'm just hoping that my P's haven't popped, because P is the worst letter to try and pronounce on a microphone. So to our editor, if Pacific Power Paradox comes out well, they've done a good job. So, Van Jackson, thanks for joining us today on Current Affairs.
Thanks, man. Longtime fan.
Hey, and we here at Current Affairs are fans of your work too. If people want to understand U.S. foreign policy in the Pacific, they need to turn to your book and to your writings in Foreign Affairs magazine and elsewhere. You have been, over the last few years, highly critical of U.S. policy in the Indo-Pacific, but I think that Americans generally, I have to say, probably on average, aren't aware that we have a policy in the Indo-Pacific. So I think if you ask the average voter, because we know that foreign policy just really is not discussed much in American political discourse or discussed in the mainstream. So I think where I want to start is by asking you, what is important that you think everyone ought to know? This is going to be hard because they need to read your book to understand the full scope of things. So we're going to boil it down. But where do we start in what everyone ought to know about what the U.S. stance in the Pacific is?
Man, that is a big question. It's important to start, I guess, with an understanding that, when American policy officials talk about America's role in Asia and in the Pacific, they lean heavily on the rhetoric of free and open. There's a lot of liberal discourse focuses a lot on the rhetoric of openness. They don't mean it even a little bit.
Okay.
I'm not saying that they're being disingenuous. I'm saying that American foreign policy practice diverges radically from the rhetoric. And so I think most people are true believers. Some are cynics. So they believe that they're fighting for an open world. But what the rhetoric of openness and freedom does in practice is mask and deflect from what is a policy and a strategy of deliberate domination. They seek primacy in every sense. And in the Trump era, there was a national security strategy document that got declassified where they were laying this out. They're American preeminence is the supreme national interest of America. And preeminence spans every domain of life, political, economic, military. And it's Biden's people have more romantic ideas than that. They believe they're standing up for something. But what they're instantiating through policy is the search for domination and primacy in a world where that's not so easy to do anymore. And so a lot of the dangers and risks are downstream of this pursuit of primacy, because we think that we're part of an open world. We're not practicing that by any stretch.
So people will hear a narrative of American idealism and will hear that our job is to, and the reason that it's important for us to have power across the rest of the world is to keep autocracies and authoritarian governments from having an outsized share of control and influence. But you say that this is a narrative about our pursuit of freedom and openness, but is contradicted by the facts. So what are some examples of things that contradict or unsettle this narrative, things that, if that were true, we would do, but we don't do?
Yeah, so when Hillary Clinton was Secretary of State, she announced what was called the pivot to Asia in, I think, 2011. And she said something in the pages of Foreign Policy magazine, she wrote that Asia is eager for our business and our leadership because we play this indispensable role in Asia as a Pacific power. We are the indispensable Pacific power. And Joe Nye, he called us Asia's oxygen. John Mearsheimer called us Asia's pacifier, right? This is the way everyone in Washington is conditioned to think. This is the way I used to think once upon a time, right? I worked in Obama's Pentagon. And it's just taken for granted that like America is an exceptionalist power in the Pacific as in the rest of the world. And so that means that like our supremacy is in the Washington mind a public good. It's what stands between us and the world going to shit. And so that's the prevailing narrative. But when you look at 2017, the nuclear crisis, it was the closest we came to nuclear war since the Cuban Missile Crisis, right? That is like a pretty widely acknowledged problem and diagnosis, threat. It was Trump blustering into Kim Jong-un blustering, right? It's the most direct example of us threatening the Asian peace because North Korea is not a peaceful actor, let's be clear. But North Korea did not change suddenly in 2017. You know what changed? Our president changed, you know?
Right. We got a fire and fury president.
That's right.
Yeah.
We started escalating coercive signaling. We started threatening fire and fury. We started talking about a bloody nose option, preventive attack, right? We were threatening violence even if they did certain kinds of non-violent weapons tests. Even though North Korea is not a peaceful actor, even though North Korea makes all kinds of blustery threats themselves, you cannot put all the danger of 2017 on North Korea. And I wrote a book about that, and like it made me sit with how the fuck are we so complicit in this nightmarish situation?
Yeah. There's something that happens in the way that the information that Americans get to know about the rest of the world. We see the things that other people do, but we don't see the things that we do that sometimes cause the things that other people do. So we'll be told about the actions, and it may be the case, for example, the case of China, there is increasing belligerent and militarist rhetoric coming. But there is almost no examination. I don't think most people even know. I'm sure that about 95, in fact, that might be an underestimate, percent of people could not tell you anything about the level of US military activity in the Pacific, right? So what is this kind of missing piece that help us start to think about the things that we don't see that we do that cause some of the things that we do see that other people do?
Yeah, I mean, so the North Korean nuclear crisis is like a little too on the nose as being contrary to the narrative of ourselves as like an upholder of the Asian peace. But there were other direct examples too. That wasn't the first nuclear crisis. And surprise, every nuclear crisis in East Asia since the 80s had us involved in it. You know, it was Reagan's military buildups and horizontal escalation in the 80s that was the backdrop to the nuclear crisis in 83, right? In 1994, we had another nuclear crisis with North Korea where we were threatening to attack and we were posturing to attack. It was like a bizarro security dilemma, and like we were bringing it on ourselves. And so like those direct ways, there are indirect ways in which we sort of like embrittle security too. It's a little bit in like a dialectical way. Like the paradox is like a normal man's way of talking about a dialectic, you know? Like understanding the sources of the Asian peace, which is like what the book spends so much time focusing on, is like key to sort of making sense of this landscape. So alliances, even among liberals, alliances are considered this vital thing that helps prop up stability, that supports the Asian peace. Yet to the extent that that's true, there's a problem in U.S. foreign policy in being inconsistent with that, because in 1985, we cut off an ally permanently, New Zealand, because they did one thing that we didn't like, right? We had conflicting policies about nuclear deployments, right? And New Zealand is a nuclear-free country, didn't want nuclear-powered submarines in their territory. that limit on American domination was too much to countenance. So we cut off allies, even though 2 years earlier we had declared, Paul Wolfowitz, fucking in the Reagan era, declared New Zealand a permanent ally. And they claim, even in the liberal narrative, that allies are what supports stability. Yet we take that risk because it challenged our ability to dominate. Asian regionalism, multilateralism, a lot of neocons and stuff would call it's feckless, it's talk shops, right? It's worse than useless, Asian regionalism. But we actively made it that way. Since the 80s, we have consistently tried to make Asian regional institutions weak and informal. Reagan issued a national security memo directive saying that regionalism should be open, informal, and led by the private sector for private sector interests, right? We vetoed every regional arrangement that has been proposed for Asia if it didn't center us, right? The Asian financial crisis, which the region blames on us, and they're not wrong, that is downstream of the political economy of American hegemony. There's like a longer story there. I don't want to start getting into it unless you want to, but the political economy of American hegemony is centered on American military primacy. So it's like our need to have military dominance produces imbalances in the global economic order that destabilizes other fucking economies. And then that's what brings on security problems.
Yeah, I do think there may be listeners for whom the political economy of American hegemony could use break it down a little bit.
Yeah, sure. I mean, so since the 1970s, America's had repeated military buildups in response to perceived threats, right? Whether it's Soviet military buildup and we're responding, or it's the war on terror or whatever. There have been multiple periods where we do these large scale buildups. This is why America's military is so ginormous, right? Well, we have done that under conditions where we don't raise taxes. On 4 different instances since the 70s. Because we don't raise taxes, but we're spending so bigly on the fucking military, we have to bring in large amounts of foreign capital to finance it. And so you create global imbalances when you're the giant sucking machine, sucking in foreign capital into your economy. And the result of that is not just global imbalances, which produces things like the Asian financial crisis. It produces imbalances in our own economy too. It creates real estate bubbles, right? So this is a giant volatility machine, and the global economic order and the financial pipes that bring the capital to us. We know it's a giant volatility machine. It's driven by high risk financial instruments and speculation. And all of this is pretty destabilizing in a financial sense, in a creating bubble sense, but it also creates a system where all of these developing economies in Asia, they have to suppress labor rights in order to be competitive in the export market because their models of development rely on exports. And so this system that we sort of perpetuate in the name of supporting military primacy, and military primacy is supposed to be in turn supporting the system, what that series of flows, what that process does is prevents domestic redistribution and prevents balanced capital labor relations in these other Asian economies, in these other Asian countries. And so not only are we creating conditions where labor rights get repressed and you have these imbalances in other countries, that creates systems of kleptocracy and oligarchy, which is rampant in Asia. Not everywhere, but it's pretty prominent. And that's structural violence. And structural violence is what gives way to greater political insecurity. And then that's what makes countries need Chinese capital. And Chinese capital spreading around Asia is one of the things American foreign policy is so worried about. And that's the dialectic, because it's we're creating conditions that we don't like. And then we do things that worsen those conditions,
Yeah, it seems ultimately kind of self-defeating, even though we might say that what lies beneath, as you said, the rhetoric of freedom and openness is the desire to pursue dominance, hegemony, US, what are called US interests. Ultimately, I think one of the conclusions of your work is that our current approach is not actually leading towards a world where the United States gets everything it wants, but is in fact putting not only other people, but also ourselves in quite a bit of danger.
Yeah, I mean, the thing that Washington has to wake up to, that I'm worried that it will not, because it has incentives to not, wake up to it, is that the requirements of peace and the requirements of primacy are deeply at odds with each other. Peace requires a certain degree of like economic interdependence. It requires a certain amount of regional cohesion. It requires inclusivity in various ways. And above all, it requires military restraint.
Mm.
And primacy requires the exact opposite of all of that, right? Primacy requires the formation of rivalry geoeconomic blocks. Primacy requires containment against your rising rival. Primacy requires arms racing. It requires weapons proliferation. And so, like, it's patently obvious that, like, by pursuing primacy, we're making ourselves the enemy of what remains of the Asian peace. And it's that insistence on primacy, coded rhetorically as openness, that is undermining the sources of the Asian peace. And so the preservation of stability the past 44 years is something that we sort of take for granted in Washington, and we should not, because it's eroding rapidly. And Trump was simply a very vibrant data point along a larger trend line. And so that we're not on a good track. Yeah.
Yeah, because you point out that some of the militarization of Asia that you criticized the United States for pushing occurred under Obama. In fact, there was a response to one of your articles in Foreign Affairs by someone who was quite indignant and suggested, and one of the points they made was, well, this began under Obama. And, I think for the nuclear modernization or something like that. And you're like, yes, it doesn't really affect my point that that Obama was part of this as well.
One of the weird things, I'm not anti-liberal by any stretch, so I don't want to leave the wrong impression. But like one of the weird things about liberals is that they obsess about apportioning blame. And it's like everything is about blame because blame is the politics of deflection. And if you believe in American exceptionalism, then you have to make sure America's blameless. And so like they're not thinking ecologically or relationally or structurally. They don't give two shits about the interactivity that's inherent in international relations. They care about making sure America's blameless. And so that's their starting point and that's their ending point. And it makes it hard to have an actual conversation about the analytics,
Yeah, I want to read the last part of that response that was written to you, just to give a sense of what the alternate narrative is. So this guy who was writing in Foreign Affairs, Thomas Shugart, said that what is actually happening, contrary to what you say, is, quote, Washington is finally coming to recognize the looming danger that an aggressive and increasingly powerful techno-authoritarian Chinese regime poses to the region and the world, and taking action accordingly. Failing to recognize this danger and to pursue appropriate responses would increase the chance of conflict by making it more likely that the leaders of the Chinese Communist Party will someday decide that the military balance of power has tipped in their favor and that they should take advantage of the shift by resorting to force. So why is that narrative wrong?
Everything about that is wrong. Everything about that is made up, right? He's using words incorrectly. It's complete fucking horseshit, and it only passes in Washington because it sounds semi-sophisticated, right? So, like, the language that they're expressing here is in the idiom of national security. They talk about the balance of power, balancing, right? Well, not only are balance of power systems inherently unstable, see fucking World War I, right? But the balance of power rests on establishing equilibriums in the distribution of power, right? What we have currently is an extreme imbalance of power favoring the United States. And one of the nuances that gets lost is that that's true basically everywhere in the world except the Taiwan Strait. And so this is where like my Pentagon background comes in, because like I'm fluent in this national security bullshit. And the Taiwan Strait, it just happens that the correlation of forces, because of the geography, because it's on Chinese coast, right? It's a place where we cannot establish military superiority. There's just no way to do it unless we put lots of US gear and troops in Taiwan, which is obviously a casus belli. That would obviously create war. But if we don't do that, there is no ability to rectify the imbalance of power against us in that spot. But in the rest of the world, we have a large margin of advantage in the balance of power. And so what people in DC, what that guy is responding to, what he's saying is like, oh, the balance of power is shifting. We have to arms race because if it's shifting, then like, I don't know, the world ends. But that's missing the fact that both like, if the balance of power shifts, that doesn't mean anything necessarily for what China does. You have to make a separate argument analytically about like, how does Chinese intentions change? Does their willingness to go to war change if the balance of power shifts? You have to make that argument. Nobody really makes that argument. That dude certainly didn't. It's just assumed.
There's kind of a piece of information often left out in many of these conversations that talk about the threat posed by a rising China, which is, where are we talking about? As you said, we're talking about the ability of the United States to remain dominant off the Chinese coast, right?
Yeah.
Not off the coast of Florida. And all of this stuff that kind of almost implicitly assumes that the United States has an entitlement by virtue of its, moral superiority over all other nations, which it's just assumed to be our great and wonderful values of openness and freedom, that we are entitled to be the dominant power, not only where we are in the Western Hemisphere, in the Americas, but also in the China's neighborhood.
Yeah, I mean, it's the definition of militarism is when the preparations for war overtake public policy, overtake the demands for democracy in any meaningful sense, overtake the steady art of statecraft, which is to say like rational foreign policy making. And that's what's happening when we're doing the arms race thing, when we're defining the PLA, China's military, has local military superiority in fucking Beijing. Well, surprise. I mean, like, what? Is that your standard that you have to overcome? You're choosing the most unfavorable situation ever, and then you're indexing what your baseline requirement is for the military to it. And this is the rhetoric and the logic trap that's used to justify what would otherwise be seen as just wildly obscene, $868 billion. Like, we're closing in on $1 trillion defense budget. And Biden outbid Trump, Trump outbid Obama. It just keeps getting worse. Why does it keep getting worse? Well, you can point to corruption and stuff like that, which is all true. But it's also that you have these like feeble intellectual constructs in national security that are putting a veneer of legitimacy over this, like the lipstick on the pig. The idea that like we have to achieve military overmatch, military superiority in the geography of our closest adversary's highest capability is unreasonable. And it's the justification to say, well, we have to cut the welfare state, or we can't do anything about climate.
Right. Yeah, there are all sorts of things that fall by the wayside. And obviously, it's been very depressing to watch the collapse of the US ability to cooperate with China on various pressing global problems. To what extent is conflict with China the product of self-defeating and disastrous US policy versus an inevitability that we cannot control because of policies that come out of China itself without our ability to impact them?
I mean, so like China, it's a hard thing to answer. China experts, the sane ones, would tell you that like China's trajectory of deciding that it needed to be able to like militarily deal with the United States. Like China's military is not designed to like fight America one-on-one. It's designed to be able to keep America at bay while China deals with like a smaller actor in the region. Because like China's not trying to actually conquer the United States. It's just trying to keep the United States out of its sphere of influence or whatever at worst, in the worst case scenario. So like the China's PLA, People's Liberation Army, started out on that track after the Taiwan Strait crisis in 96, right? They realized, because we made nuclear threats at that point, sort of subtly. And we put an aircraft carrier sort of into the region, in the area, as like a very veiled threat, if you will. they were aware of like a military imbalance, basically, and that we have a conflict of interest over Taiwan. And so they decided to set out on that track. But those are defense decisions, right? Just like America's defense decisions to pursue primacy and all this stuff, they're based on chasing shadows, but it's in a reasonable, rational state of foreign policy that's kept in its own silo. You don't let that dominate the rest of the foreign policy agenda. Statecraft should not be reducible to what your military does. The military should be subordinate to like a larger apparatus. And so just because the PLA committed to that military track of balancing against us does not mean that like we were off to the races by any stretch. It doesn't mean that China was a rival, but the neocons were plotting in the 90s. And then when they came onto George W. Bush's campaign in 2001, they were trying to create great power competition back then. They were set on rivalry then. But then the war on terror happened and it sidetracked everything. So it was the US plotting this for a long time. And we were playing a balancing game militarily against their military, but it was within a political framework of like great power détente, great power cooperation, right? And the neoliberals of the Bush era were perversely on the side of stability in this internal debate, right? Because they didn't want great power competition. They wanted Goldman Sachs to fucking go over there and make some money. And that neoliberal grip on policy has waned. And on the left, like we're happy to see it. We'd love to see it in certain respects. But it's like they were the most powerful constituency against this whole rivalry impulse the whole time. And China's assertiveness, a little bit of it you see on the military side starting in 2007, but it's really starting in like 2008, 2009. And it's not because they're communist, because China's neoliberalism's greatest success story, if we're being clear-eyed, right? They're hyper-capitalist. It's not that they're communist, right? It's not a clash of civilizations because it's the same civilization before 2008 and since 2008. It's not that Xi Jinping is evil, even though he might be, right? He's a tyrant. But Xi Jinping didn't come to power till 2012, 2013. But the aggressiveness started ramping up in 2007, 2008. So a little bit of this is the product of the military-industrial complex. A lot of it is the global financial crisis, which, again, we brought that on. And it fed perceptions in China of the decline of American authority and legitimacy. And you get neocons even right now arguing in the Wall Street Journal, like Robert Kagan. The neocons today are arguing that, and everyone in DC is a fucking neocon now, by the way, but they're arguing that like China is perceiving America in decline because we're getting weaker. And it's about weakness. And Chinese perceptions of American decline are not about strength and weakness. It's about legitimacy and authority being in decline. And as we take steps to revise the international order that we claim to defend, we further undermine our legitimacy and authority, right? And so people like Bob Kagan and the neocons want this to be about strength and military power because then the answer is more military power.
Yeah.
And that's not what it's about at all. And so like China's being more aggressive, but military power is not any kind of answer to that.
I think one can get just from reading the titles of your foreign affairs articles. America is turning Asia into a powder keg. America's Indo-Pacific folly. Adding new commitments in Asia will only invite disaster. The problem with primacy. America's dangerous quest to dominate the Pacific. That a persistent theme of your work is that we are creating the conditions for an avoidable calamity that doesn't have to happen if we understand how the world works and we understand other countries a little more realistically and we have better foreign policy. We could avoid stumbling into what might be a pretty hideous, violent confrontation with nuclear armed power.
Yes, that's right. There's nothing inevitable about conflict with China. There was not anything inevitable about rivalry with China either until, I don't know, the global financial crisis. Like, it's the way that we're set up in foreign policy, and it's the way that we've refused to see how we create structures that incentivize behaviors in others, like China, that we don't like. It's that failure to see how all of this stuff is connected that leads us to this view of like everything bad in the world is because of some bad guy who's not us. And it's just a mystery why they're bad. Like, that's not good analysis.
They hate us for our freedom, man. They hate us for our freedom.
That's exactly what's going on now. And so, of course, we're going to arms race with balloons and stuff, because we're blameless.
Well, yeah, the balloon just happened. Yeah, I need your take on the balloon. I need your hot take on the balloon.
Nonsense. It's so nonsense. The thing is, like, I mean, it probably was a surveillance, like, spy balloon. It probably wasn't just a weather balloon. But
sure,
if you choose rivalry, this is the price of rivalry. Spy versus spy.
They send balloons.
Espionage, yeah. The decision to have espionage happen, the condition of possibility for that is endemic rivalry. So if you choose rivalry, there are certain costs and risks that go along with that. And America, again, being blameless, doesn't like to look at the costs and risks. They like to make the choices and then have the costs be someone else's fucking problem. And like, that is bad history, bad analysis, and it leads to bad outcomes.
I also assume we have our own equivalent of the balloon.
Dude, nobody's mentioning this. I do mention this in Pacific Power Paradox. Part of the acceleration of Chinese, like, fucking paranoia and triumphalism in 2010, this only came to light in the last few years. In 2010, China, the CCP, discovered that the CIA had extremely high-level human intelligence plants in the party chain, in the apparatus, including in like security and intelligence ministries, And so the PLA saw that, and they saw that it was an extreme threat to regime security, and that it was the corruption of their political system itself that made them vulnerable to CIA infiltration. And so Xi Jinping, when he came to power, it was literally on the heels of this revelation that the whole regime is at stake. We have to get less corrupt, and we have to purge America out of our system. And oh yeah, they're a threat, America, right? That's the Chinese view at that point. So like, you see this huge acceleration in Chinese assertiveness, 2010, 2011, 2012. Nobody in American foreign policy talks about the fact that China stumbled onto the CIA having infiltrated them at the highest levels. Talk about surveillance. We're worried about a balloon. We're not worried about China having our vice president, I don't think. And so, like, that's a wild, wild discrepancy in the spy versus spy stuff. It's the price of rivalry. We're doing it times 1,000, but if they send a balloon, it's a problem.
Yeah, it's very strange because every time I hear people indignant about the balloon, I think, well, are you saying that we would never do this? If it's right to be, if it's fair to be indignant about it, is the assertion like, this is an impingement on sovereignty, we oppose impingements on sovereignty, right? That has to be kind of implicit in the indignation.
Yeah. National Security Agency, my friend.
It sounds as if what you're saying, correct me if I'm wrong, is that we occasionally apply standards to others and demand they conform to them that we are unwilling to apply to ourselves.
That's right. And so it all comes back to insisting on American exceptionalism. It all comes back to insisting on viewing the world in a way that exculpates us from outcomes in the world that we don't like. It's not that America is the root of all problems. I don't believe that at all.
Right.
I mean, the book is very clear-eyed about Chinese and North Korean behaviors that are destabilizing, and that policymakers try to respond to rationally, but they try to respond to it in a boundedly rational way. They respond to it in a way where the response is anchored in presumptions and narratives about American goodness that is not correct, and it leads them to extreme actions and risk-taking that they're not even really aware of. And that's why, like, Biden still thinks that we're operating this, like, America is great foreign policy that is the oxygen and the pacifier for stability, but we're actually the most volatile actor in the region at this point. We're literally re-wrenching the economic order that has helped keep peace and help bring up East Asian economies. We're wrenching it and being like, oh, we need to cut this in half. And China may be the lifeblood of your economies, but gradually we're trying to economically contain them more and more. And you're going to have to figure out new ways of surviving in the economic order that we're revising in real time.
I do think something that makes the United States an incredibly dangerous actor is just the lack of self awareness, the lack of
Yeah.
ability to perceive ourselves as others see us, to see through the eyes of anyone who is on the receiving of our policy, and this arrogance that says that we would never act in a purely self interested way because we're America. This fundamental assumption of idealism and goodness. I don't think it's widely realized that everyone in the world thinks they're good. Everyone. So you don't
Yeah.
know if you're actually good and idealistic until you check how you look to other people, because you could be one of the, everyone else who thinks they're good and isn't. You could be until you check.
It's totally true. And like, this is a genuine source of danger, ironically. And like, I used to believe all this stuff too. Like, I was a true believer in this kind of evangelical exceptionalism, the triumphalism of America's shining city on a hill in foreign policy, even though I could see that our domestic politics were a little messed up. And like, in fact, for the foreign policy mandarins in DC, it's having external threats. It's being able to externalize America's problems onto another. That's the salve psychologically. That's the psychic wage that prevents us from having to deal with our own problems. And so, like, China is a godsend to the foreign policy establishment because it means that they don't have to take a hard look at the American surveillance state, the de facto policing of Black communities, or like the deep, deep economic precarity of the majority of the population. They don't have to face any of that. They don't have to face the threat of the far-right militias, or like, the way politics is post-democratic in many senses, the oligarchic political economy that we run. There's no time for any of that. And also sort of no time for the climate crisis either, because we got to smite the big bad.
Yeah, it sounds almost like a childlike observation, but I do think to myself a lot of the time, isn't it a little weird that every time we defeat one enemy of the day and another one just immediately pops up? Isn't it weird that as the threat of fundamentalist Islamic terrorism declined, all of a sudden, we started talking about how we really, really needed to stop China from displacing us in the Pacific?
Yeah. I mean, the only answer to a bad guy with a gun is a good guy with a gun or some shit like that. It just leaves us all less secure, And analytically, so the Taiwan Strait is the powder keg these days. And the Taiwan Strait is basically a security dilemma.
I think you need to explain what that is, because that's an IR concept. So maybe you could tell us.
Yeah, security dilemma is a concept in international relations. It's basically it describes a situation where you take steps to improve your security, but those steps end up reducing everybody's security, even yours, because the other guy that you're trying to secure yourself against is perceiving what you're doing as a greater insecurity to them. So you have, let's say, defensive intentions, right? You're just trying to protect what you got. But they see that as like a greater threat to them because you're amassing arms or making threats or whatever. And so they have to respond in kind. And so you're both acting rationally. You're both acting from defensive motivations, but you're both implicated in a structure, in a situation of interactivity that leaves everybody less secure. And this is the rational logic of arms racing. Because what's the point of arms racing when you have enough nukes to destroy the world? Which we do. And so why do you keep arms racing then, right? Well, if you're trapped in a security dilemma situation, then you can still be thinking that you're the good guy and that you're just trying to protect what's yours, but you're actually making everything worse, right? Very important concept. It explains a lot about the Cold War even. And it is the situation across the Taiwan Strait. And it's hard to find anybody arguing otherwise with serious analysis. But if that's true, this is a really important thing to grasp. If we're in a security dilemma, scholars have weighed in very authoritatively here. The policy prescription for getting out of it, the best way to manage it, is carrots over sticks. It is forms of peaceful signaling, restraint, accommodation, compromise, right? You have to communicate in word and deed persistently over time that your intentions are defensive, right? And so arms racing is the opposite of what is supposed to happen. Arms racing is what commits you to tragedy, right? That's why it's a security dilemma. To escape the dilemma, it's got to be carrots over sticks. And since that situation is a dilemma, we have to follow the logical policy prescriptions to get out of it and to manage it stably. But we're not doing that. Why? Because China's 10 feet tall. It's the big bad. They're sending over balloons. We got a balloon gap, right? Time to balloon race.
That's a great concept.
What are we talking about, you know?
Yeah, we need $1 billion appropriation for balloons.
Yeah.
Clearly.
Yeah.
We need to ramp up our balloon industry. It's
the balloon industrial complex, man.
Well, is it a security dilemma, though? Because does this depend on the perceptions of the parties of their actions being defensive or their actions objectively being defensive? Because it seems to me like from a certain perspective, the U.S. insistence upon, as you mentioned earlier, kind of maintaining an unreasonable level of hegemony in Asia, where we are not located, could be seen as kind of aggressive.
I try not to make that argument too much because I have a lot of normies who are like part of my audience who follow me and like read my stuff. But there's a way in which that's probably true. Like, we are a revisionist power. It is in the nature of hegemony. Any hegemon is by its nature a revisionist power because they're imposing an order that didn't exist before, right? And so Washington takes for granted that America is the hegemon. They don't follow that to its logical conclusion, which means that we are obviously a revisionist power. If you are a revisionist power, by definition, you're the problem. I mean, like, you can't have a security dilemma if one side is a revisionist.
What do you mean by revisionist? Sorry. So what is revisionist?
Willingness to use force to get what you want.
Oh, I see.
So, like, you're going to rewrite the rules by force if necessary, right? Mm-hmm. So it's like the alternative is to be a status quo power where you're in like a defensive crouch. You just want shit to stay the same, right? Hegemons are by their nature revisionists, but we have a way of narrating our own hegemony as being status quo. This coding distinction between status quo and revisionist states is what makes the security dilemma like concept work, right? To be a security dilemma, you need to be having two defensive intentions, two sides with defensive intentions. It's not clear that the U.S. actually has defensive intentions here. Like, the mania of militarism that has overtaken the discourse, the idea that like anybody who argues for restraint or anybody who is critical of U.S. foreign policy in any respect about China is basically working for Xi Jinping, is a subversive or whatever. That's where we're at in the discourse, you know? And it's like completely normal to expect that kind of reaction if you critique U.S. foreign policy in any way. So in that kind of environment, I don't get a lot of mileage out of being like, America's the revisionist power, we need to pack it in. American retrenchment is the solution. That doesn't go very far in Washington, and like that's part of my audience. So like the next best thing is to say, okay, maybe we have defensive intentions, but so does China. And so that means let's do security dilemma prescriptions, which gets us halfway to a just stability, you know?
And I assume those prescriptions would not include the current proposed policy of turning Taiwan into what is called a porcupine, to put so many spiky-looking weapons coming out of it that nobody would ever invade it.
The porcupine thing is not a bad strategy militarily. There's not things that you're going to do in the defense space, the defense domain, that's going to solve this problem, you know? At best, you're just going to manage it more or less stably. And so, like, if you equip Taiwan with the quote-unquote porcupine capabilities, so like undersea mines and like coastal artillery and that kind of thing, defensive weapons basically that make it really costly for China to invade, that's not a bad military response. Like, that's one of the more stable things we could probably do. It's just that it doesn't solve any of the problems. It just increases the costs if China decides to invade. But we're also not quite doing that. We talk about doing that, and we do it a little bit, but like selling China F-16s doesn't contribute to a porcupine strategy. That's just like gratuitous. It's extra. And the weird part about it is that China, not Taiwan, has air superiority. They have air dominance, basically, because all of Taiwan falls within the integrated air defense range of China, because it's right next to China. And so We cannot, and Taiwan cannot, establish air superiority in the way that the US military is accustomed to in like the war on terror in Afghanistan and Iraq. And that's one of the ways in which the balance of power is not rectifiable because of the geography. And yet we sell them those kinds of weapons anyways, even though they don't affect the balance of power.
Yes, in a place where you're very unlikely to win a war or to have a war not be extremely costly, probably the best strategy is to do everything you can to avoid having one.
Yes, use instruments other than the military to try and manage this problem better. But instead, we foreclose all things except for the arming Taiwan part. And it would be one thing to arm Taiwan much better, and that's some kind of near-term intermediate fix, if we weren't also pursuing primacy ourselves and increasing our military footprint in the region, which we're doing. So like we're proliferating to allies and we're pursuing primacy ourselves. And it's like, pick a lane, buddy. Even if you did one or the other, there would be reasonable arguments for the left to take up opposition, but we're doing both. And it's like the worst of both worlds. And then somehow we're still blameless. It's like, what the fuck?
I want to conclude here by saying, when you say America is turning Asia into a powder keg, what is the situation that you envisage of the disaster situation that we could be headed towards? What would the consequences be, and how do we avoid it?
So wars are pretty much always preceded by crises. Crises are pretty much always preceded by geopolitical rivalries, right? That's the logical flow that takes us into interstate wars. So like if you're trying to like reverse engineer a war process so that you can have the opposite happen, you have to intervene in that process somewhere, right? So the danger of proliferating weapons and establishing primacy and basically encircling China, doing all of that is maybe something that you can manage at the crisis level. Maybe. It's a little bit like Russian roulette, though, because like you don't have full control over what happens. China could miscalculate, right? Ethno-nationalism could get stoked by like domestic imbalances in China. That would not be unprecedented. Like China could make a calculation that it's worth doing military adventure somewhere, and then we're into war. So we have to intervene at deeper levels to get deeper security. And that means getting ahead of crises. And so committing to rivalries is problematic because it sets us on this path toward war. Undoing rivalry, creating more buffer space between war and between crisis and our status quo, that is what we should want, right? And that requires a more competent statecraft. And there is like a military role for that in that space. It's just radically different and more restrained than what we do now.
Oh, one more thing I just wanted to get from you while I have you for our readers and listeners is, I read your stuff to understand the Pacific, but as you mentioned, so many foreign policy commentators and thinkers these days do appear to be from the war party. There is a whole rest of the world to understand. I think if people want to understand the U.S. relationship with Asian countries, they can't do better than to read your writing. But who else do you recommend that people read to get a better understanding of the world as it is that won't bias them in ways that are likely to lead to calamitous global wars?
Oh man, there's a great ecosystem of foreign policy people, largely on the left. Matt Duss, who was Bernie Sanders' foreign policy advisor, he's a very sound mind. He's a buddy too, to be honest. Tobita Chow is really great on Asia. Kate Kaiser, who co-hosts my podcast, is my go-to source on all things Middle East. She's keeping track of, Saudi receipts on the Yemen war.
Okay.
Yeah. So I don't know. There's a few there. Matt Duss, Tobita Chow. Jake Warner's really good on China too. Within the think tank space, it's mostly intellectually derelict. The Carnegie Endowment is pretty good as far as mainstream think tanks go. They're not obviously channeling any kind of dialectic energy or anything like that, but it's not like foreign policy for the working class by any stretch. But they are a pretty good source insofar as mainstreams go.
Well, we'll put links to these people in the show notes. The book is Pacific Power, Paradox, American Statecraft, and the Fate of the Asian Peace by Van Jackson, available from Yale University Press. You can also read Van Jackson's pieces in Foreign Affairs magazine. Van Jackson, thank you for joining us on Current Affairs today.
Thanks, man. This was fun.
The Current Affairs Podcast is a product of Current Affairs Magazine. If you are not subscribed to Current Affairs Magazine, visit currentaffairs.org/subscribe today and get our glorious print edition. The Current Affairs Podcast is released regularly every week on patreon.com/currentaffairs. Thanks for listening.